Okay, it looks like everyone is in that has logged in. So I will ask you all to mute yourself. If not, I will mute you in just a moment. But I cannot believe that this is the 10th week of our fall lecture series. It doesn't seem possible that we could possibly have traveled all the way from the end of World War II to the end of the Korean conflict. And in just a few short years, we're talking 8 years time frame, so much could have happened to our veterans and what they have done for them and how they could have all served in such a variety of manners that across the board, it just seems amazing to me that that could all have happened in such a short time span. And we appreciate each and every one of you for coming out. When we put this together, it was originally intended to be an in-person lecture. And even back in the spring, we had high hopes that we would be able to meet together and just do the Zoom portion of it as an extra service. And we really like having people together because sometimes those questions can be answered a little bit better. And that camaraderie of being with other people that you know and having that chance to have those discussions is always great. Going forward, it seems as though our spring lecture series, which will start on the third Monday in February 2021, will have to be again a Zoom online. If the world changes and we can do it in person, we will definitely open up the museum and we will continue to do the Zoom link because I think there's a lot of people that enjoy doing that, especially if they can't come out to the museum for that. So we'll continue that. But right now, with everything that's going on and the possibility of a vaccine not coming out until the spring and then having people take it, it'll take a little while before it gets around to everyone and where it's safe for us all to be able to gather together. So I'm hoping for fall of 2021 that our lecture series, which will be all about the 2021 fall lecture series, will all be about the more modern military and its role from the Afghan in the conflicts in Afghanistan and post Vietnam up until just about the fall of the wall in Berlin. And that'll be a very exciting time to talk about because there's so much that has gone on in the military that no one really knows about, including myself. There are so many different times that the military has been engaged in many different conflicts over the course of time, but they're not well known. And so that will be our spring lecture series. And in the fall, we will cover the Afghanistan conflicts and all of the time of our military in the Middle East over the last 30 years. Um, for those of you that come to our lectures and any of our members, on Wednesday evening at the Muskegon Area District Library's website, you can go to, they will be having a presentation on a truly Muskegon story of called the Ghost Mountain Boys. Um, they only have capacity for 100 in their Zoom, actual Zoom area. So if you wish to go to the actual Zoom, you need to register for that. If you do not have the opportunity or it's full already, they will be live streaming it on the Muskegon Area District Library's website and excuse me, on their Facebook page, live streaming it on their Facebook page. And so there's an opportunity for you to go there. James Campbell will be speaking about the book that he wrote, The Ghost Mountain Boys, and it highlights a lot of the men from Muskegon who, because they were in a National Guard unit that was nationalized, went together to form a unit in the military, which was not common anymore at that point because they no longer wanted large groups of people from one community to possibly perish or from one family together in a certain conflict. So they tried to break the people up so that they would be in different units so there would not be the same amount of loss of life in that one community. This was a different group because they were a National Guard unit that was nationalized and they were brought in and they served together through some of the most horrific terrain and the most horrific stories of what they went through in order to meet their objective in New Guinea. If you are not familiar with it, I highly recommend that you, using the link that we sent to you, either go to the Muskegon Area District Library's website and register to be part of the Zoom. But if that's filled up already, please take the time to go to their Facebook page at 6 o'clock on Wednesday evening, and it'll be live streamed there as well. I would like to thank all of our sponsors. Without our sponsors, none of this would be possible. And we are just delighted that the Birch Family Foundation has sponsored this entire fall lecture series for us. And if you run into that family, please give them a big round of applause. It is through their generosity and their family's dedication to service in the community that this has all come about. They feel that education is one of the reasons that people go into service. And they agree with many things that the museum says about that it's very hard to honor a group of people unless you understand what it is that they've done and what they've done for our country and what they've done to preserve the freedoms that we all have. And thank you to the Birch Foundation for sponsoring us, and also to Blue Lake Radio. They have been our media sponsor throughout the entire time, and we appreciate having them as our sponsor. They do a wonderful job about letting the world know about what's going on at the museum, and we're truly appreciative of that. In this season of giving, if you enjoyed all of these programs that you've seen here thus far throughout the fall, please consider making a donation to the museum. I know all of you know that our regular attendees that the museum does not receive any state, federal, or local funding. All of our operations have been done and are done through the kind and generous donations of our communities and the veterans and through our guests that come to the museum. And we appreciate each and every one of you for doing that. And if you enjoy this type of programming, please help us to continue doing these programmings. This year has been very difficult on every historical institution around the country because many of us have been closed for months on end. We have restrictions in the number of people that can come to the museum, and we have restrictions on several of other aspects of our business, such as we normally at this point would be running an overnight program where we have scouting groups or church groups spending nights on the submarine and learning American history firsthand. None of that is happening. So if you're thinking about the end of the year, please consider making a donation to the museum. Donations can be made on our website, or they can be mailed directly to the museum. And if any of you would like a personal letter from me asking you for that, I will be more than happy to do that. And if any of you are on our mailing list, you'll be receiving a letter from us in the very near future and asking for your continued support. We've been very lucky. Most museums have only seen a 5 to 10% return of their guests this year. We've seen probably closer to 50%, which has been an extraordinary help, but everyone's budget has been very hard hit because of the pandemic. And so the first and foremost that we always do is we always preserve our vessels and we always take care of our artifacts. When we were closed, the preservation of our artifacts never stopped. And it costs us, without a moment of salaries or any other things, it costs $350 a day just for the general maintenance of the building and our vessels to make sure that they're properly heated, that there's no water issues, that there's insurance and all of those things. And so those things are out there, and we appreciate anyone that gives us any support in that regard. Tonight, as I said, it is hard to imagine that we have been here for 10 weeks and that it is coming to the close of this fall series. If anyone has not watched these with us live, please feel free to go to our YouTube channel at the USS Silversides Submarine Museum on YouTube, and you'll be able to see all of these lectures again, and you'll be able to share them with your friends and family. And so I hope you do that. Tonight, our speaker is one of our favorites, Ron Janowski. For those of you that have been with us for the last few weeks, you know he's given a wonderful presentations about the history, the beginnings, what happened in the Korean conflict, how we got there. And tonight he's going to wrap it up and tell us what the Korean conflict means to us as a nation and how it has been a part of our lives. Even though the Korean conflict has never been very well spoken of, and it's almost like it's forgotten, but it's there. We have wonderful veterans that have served. It's served a way of promoting the American policies at that point in Asia. And as you can see, it was also part of a bigger conflict that went on for many more years going forward. One of the trends in history right now is to look at Korea and Vietnam and just make them as large battles in the conflict of the Cold War. I go against that 100% and say no. They're individual conflicts, yes, in a greater part of American military history, and they have been happening simultaneously to this other one. But our veterans need to be honored for what they did when they did it, and their service to our country shall never be forgotten, especially not by us at the Silversides, because it's so important. So, without further ado, I will turn this over to Ron, and he will inform us going forward. If you have not muted yourself, please do, or I will be doing it for you in just a moment. So, thank you. Ron, you have the screen.
Thank you, Peggy. History is our narrative. History is our story. We study history because it tells us where we've been, where we are now, and by considering both of those, what is possible for us in the future. Welcome all to this, the Silverside Museum Fall Lecture Series on the World Transformed 1945 to 1953. Tonight we return to Korea. Over the last 2 weeks, we've discussed the foundations of the Korean conflict, what events laid the path for the Korean conflict to happen. Last week, we discussed the war itself, the conflict as it was pursued by the United States and the United Nations and continued for the 3 years from 1950 to 1953. Tonight, we conclude the trilogy as we discuss the resolution and the legacy of the Korean conflict, what it means to us following the conflict, what it means to us today, and what it may mean to us looking into the future. I'm Colonel Ron Janowski, and I'll be your host. At the end of World War II, communism, which had promised to completely replace capitalism as the dominant social and economic system of the world, had had an uneasy alliance with the Western powers in order to destroy Nazi Germany. That done, the forces of the Red Army, which had advanced across Eastern Europe, simply chose not to retreat. Instead, they became the military muscle for the Soviet Union and for communism to establish communist puppet governments within Eastern European governments, to establish a threat and a promise to continue expanding, as first stipulated by Karl Marx. In a similar way, across the most populous country in the world, China had become, after a long civil war, a communist country in 1949. And now suddenly, in the blink of a historical eye, the world saw that much of the world had turned red, as if to confirm that Karl Marx's theory and his forecast might just come true. This, of course, would become the 40-year conflict, a non-shooting between the main adversaries called the Cold War. Whatever conflict might have occurred would be largely in proxies, although there would be exceptions on both sides. The United States would be dedicated to stopping the expansion of communists country by country, region by region, avoiding the toppling of dominoes in order to keep momentum from allowing the communist forces to spread across the world. The first test of this policy, this first domino to be shored up, would be the peninsula of Korea. Korea had for 35 years been under the dominant heel of the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. Of course, with the destruction of the Japanese Empire in 1945, communism, or I should say the Japanese Empire was removed, but the time was not yet ready for Korea to lead their own lives. The peninsula was arbitrarily divided in half. The top half, North Korea, was established as a communist government by the Soviets, very much as they had done in Europe. The southern half of South Korea, under the sponsorship of the United States, was established as a democracy along the lines of the American Constitution. The Korean people were not happy with this arrangement. They longed to be reunited, and they fought somehow to find a way to come back to being a single country. This was more aggressively sought by the North Korean government. And along the border of the 38th parallel, several aggressive acts occurred over the years from 1949 to 1950. But the Koreans were held in check, the North Koreans were held in check until their Russian sponsors could feel comfortable going toe-to-toe with the United States, which had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. That came to an end in 1949 with the Soviets detonating their first atomic weapon, and they gave the go-ahead for the North Koreans to invade the South. President Harry S. Truman was determined to stop this domino from falling. He was determined that the United States would step in and halt the expansion and the domination of the South by the North. But his concerns were real. The world had changed a great deal in the 5 years since World War II. One thing, Japan was being developed into an economic powerhouse, as was Germany, by the Allied nations. The United States and Britain sought to build these into strong economic forces that would form as bulwarks against Soviet expansion, bulwarks against the fall of the dominoes towards communism. Under no conditions would Truman allow any domination or any conflict in the peninsula of Korea to threaten the burgeoning economic power that would become Japan. Truman was also aware that the Russians had a great deal of interest in continuing their expansion in Europe. They had already solidified their hold on Eastern Europe. They would have loved to have continued on into Western Germany, France, and beyond. He didn't want any possibility of being so focused on Korea and Asia that he would allow the Russians to further expand in Europe. And of course, the big one, with nuclear weapons now on the board, there was great concern that a misstep might lead to an exchange of nuclear weapons and a quick escalation into a resumption of war, this time nuclear, leading to massive destruction on a scale that was not exaggerated to be biblical in nature. Truman had an ace in the hole. He had in the Pacific Theater in Japan one of the most legendary and experienced military minds of the 20th century, Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had served in uniform for nearly 50 years, having graduated from West Point in 1903. He had accomplished and been successful at almost every possible concern a military officer could, and at the present was actually rebuilding the government of Japan from a monarchy into a democracy based on the Constitution. Upon the conflict building and growing in Korea, Truman turned to MacArthur to manage the military, which of course MacArthur did. The conflict would be fought by the West under the flag not of the United States, but of the United Nations. The United Nations would represent 16 different countries providing military forces, combat forces, to contest the aggression that was being visited on the South by the North. And on June 25th of 1950, the North invaded. The flow of battle went back and forth across the 38th parallel, finally concluding in July of 1953 and ending, ironically enough, just north of the 38th parallel where it had all begun. War had been brutal. Weather conditions were terrible. Hot summers, freezing winters. Casualties had been great on both sides. And caught in the middle, of course, were the Korean people themselves, caught with a conflict that held their future yet unknown. Both sides exhausted. On the 27th of July of 1953, a truce was signed. Not an end to the war, but simply a ceasefire. It stands that way still today. The truce line set approximately 35 miles north of Seoul, just north of the 38th parallel. After all the conflict, after all the pain and suffering, they ended up pretty much as they had begun. And not with an end, but only a ceasefire. Casualties were over 500,000 for the United Nations forces, 3 times that for the North Koreans. And for the Chinese, never to be confirmed, but estimated to be nearly 1 million Chinese died as well. So the question tonight is, for what? What is the legacy? What is the resolution of the Korean conflict? Every military event, every historical event has lessons learned, and we are wise to seek them out, break them apart, study them, learn from them. For the Korean conflict, I have 4. And this sort of enters into Peggy's question last week about what to discuss over Thanksgiving meal. Here are my 4. Korea was not called a war, but a police action. I was asked this question a couple of weeks ago, why it was called that. And I gave an answer that I've done more research on since, and I want to expand on that here and now. The United Nations was the overarching flag under which the war, the conflict, the police action was fought. But why a police action? Strictly defined, a police action, as fought by these 16 against these 3, is a military action undertaken, and here's the operative word, without a formal declaration of war. Why is that important? Why is that key? Why is that necessary without a formal declaration of war? Well, a moment ago, I told you that Harry Truman was very concerned in the final analysis of nuclear war. He feared that if a formal declaration of war were made and the sides really went at it, it would be inevitable, as things actually attempted under MacArthur to become, a nuclear conflict. Truman, with a presence beyond his years, recognized the futility of attempting to fight a nuclear war, the horror, the slippery slope that could not be remounted. He wanted to avoid this at all costs. And therefore, Truman, as the real power in the United States, did provide most of the force within the United Nations contingent. Truman purposely sought that Korea would not be fought as a full declaration of war, but only under limited military operations. This would send a message to the other side. It would send a message to commanders that this conflict would not be fought with no holds barred. It would most definitely be fought with holds barred, forming perhaps the hallmark of the conflict for soldiers and civilians alike, the sheer confusion of what are we attempting to do? Why are we not allowed to do it fully? It would ironically be repeated some years later in Vietnam, and pretty much for the same reasons. That's for another study. As I say, this limited form of conflict confused all, not the least of which was Douglas MacArthur. My second learning point is the supremacy of civilian authority over the military. Our Constitution specifically says that the commander-in-chief is a civilian, the president. Douglas MacArthur was an experienced and learned and iconic military leader, perhaps one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. But the concept of limited war, frankly, confused him. He desired to win the war, as any military would, but he desired to win it in the way that he knew best. He had fought in World War I, he had fought in World War II, he had fought tooth and nail until the enemy had been destroyed and defeated. He wanted to do the same thing here. He saw this as the same opportunity. He knew he could do it, but he was not allowed to do it. And as a result, he threatened the very authority of the commander-in-chief by attempting to subvert the authority of Truman and ultimately lead to the inevitable, the firing of MacArthur by Truman. It is important in our Constitution that the tenets that were laid out by the founding fathers, not the least of which is the command of the military by civilians, be cherished and protected. Truman essentially had no choice but to relieve a man who threatened that security. He said it was not for the sake of military judgment that MacArthur was fired, but it was for the sheer protection of the Constitution of the United States. Some years later, in the following administration of Eisenhower, a wrinkle came about as far as military being subservient to civil authority. In his farewell address in 1961, Eisenhower spoke to the military-industrial complex. Following World War II, the military had become big business, and more so, the technology to create weapons. They formed a natural team. Eisenhower, uniquely suited as a former military five-star general himself, saw the danger in this alliance between the users and the makers of weapons to influence policy, to influence the policy of the United States and the world. And he warned against it. The authority of civilian over military must be protected. It must be maintained then, now, and on into the future for the stability of our world. The third lesson learned was the Truman Doctrine, also known as the National Security Council Note number 68. And this is a familiar one. Following the end of World War II, as the Red Army returned or did not remove itself from Eastern Europe, it established a boundary, a barrier, a wall between East and West, something that Winston Churchill called in his wonderful grasp of the English language, an iron curtain has fallen across the face of Europe. This iron curtain promised expansion, further demands by the communists to continue their expansion in fulfillment of Marx's promise of domination. Truman worded this policy as compelled to assist free peoples in their struggle against totalitarian regimes. This was clearly stopping communism from further expanding. It became documented and codified as the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and it was the stopping of these dominoes which would continue to fall and threaten the Western world if allowed. Korea, of course, would be the first of these dominoes to be addressed, and it was, and successfully halted, even at the ludicrous conclusion of being only 35 miles from where they started. But nevertheless, it was a success. Others would follow. A few years later, the French, in their Indochina colony, were soundly defeated by communist forces at the Battle of Bien Phu in 1954. As the French withdrew from Indochina, the Americans took up the mantle, seeing yet another domino to be protected. Of course, the country in time would change its name from the colonial name of Indochina into the better known Vietnam, and the United States would once again fight to keep the domino from falling. Other dominoes around the world included Berlin, the divided city, which only a few years earlier had the Russians attempt to blockade into submission, but the West had been able to hold that domino standing. In our own hemisphere, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba became a communist force. That has been a perpetual problem for the American government, which includes up to today. Other dominoes existed throughout the world, and the United States and the West have dealt with them as they've come. The Cold War has been the United States policy then for over 40 years, and Korea was its first domino to be held up. I want to divert just for a moment and talk about this domino theory. It began in Korea, of course, and was popularized under the Kennedy administration as the domino theory. But how effective and how true it was, and I have just a chart to address that just for a moment. We feared that with the fall of Vietnam, that the entire region would, as dominoes, fall. Well, let me show you what actually has happened to date. Of course, in 1975, South Vietnam fell and Vietnam was united as a communist government. Next door in Laos, they too fell to become communist. However, in Cambodia and Thailand, they both became constitutional monarchies. And in Indonesia, Burma, India, and Bangladesh, they have become strongly democratic countries to this day. So the domino theory that we so ardently believed in and so strongly fought to protect and to pursue, at least in the case of Southeast Asia, was disproved. And in fact, the events in Southeast Asia led to an eventual splitting between China and the Soviet Union, a reverse domino, as it were. This is not to say that momentum cannot be gained in politics as well as in a football game or anything else, but the domino theory is not a be-all, end-all. Back to Korea. A few weeks ago, Peggy asked the question, what can I talk about? What were the main things coming out of Korea? And these were three of them, but because of that discussion, I've added a fourth. You may recall that was nuclear operations. The use of nuclear weapons for the first time was on the table in Korea. The United States, of course, had detonated nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Russians became the second world nuclear power in 1949, and in 1950, the possibility was there. And in fact, MacArthur even suggested it. The discussion of nuclear operations is a deep one and a frightful one, frankly. Initially, it was thought that nuclear weapons were simply a bigger bang. This, by the way, is not a nuclear weapon. This is actually the 22,000-pound, 11-ton big boy conventional bomb developed by the British towards the end of World War II. It's a big one, but it's conventional. And it was thought that nuclear weapons would simply be one more step up from that. But how wrong we were. It was not just a bigger bang. It was a thing of nightmares. It was a force so destructive, so devastating, that even now we cannot comprehend the use of it reasonably in warfare without the threat of annihilation of one or both sides. This is a weapon that can turn buildings into shells, cities into rubble, And human beings, nothing more than shadows on a sidewalk. The use of nuclear weapons is a horrifying, nightmarish, apocalyptic consideration that first began discussion, not resolution, discussion during Korea and is ongoing still today. So, lessons learned, police action, civil over military, the Truman Doctrine, nuclear operations, limited war. But what of Korea? What has the Korean conflict meant to Korea over these past 70 years? The line of armistice runs across the Korean Peninsula, running about 160 miles, roughly the distance from Muskegon to Chicago. It has remained so for 70 years and still today. It is heavily guarded. It is manned by both sides, strictly by the book, with no allowance for deviation. And largely over the past 70 years, it has been a quiet, there have been conflicts, certainly. There have been shots fired, but no big explosions, save one. In August of 1976, an incident occurred, which thankfully was a blip and not to be repeated, but it did happen. This particular chart shows the joint security area. It is the jointly manned North and South, North Korean, South Korean, Communist and United Nations force outpost. The red line denotes the separation between the North and the South. And you'll notice in dead center, there are buildings that are separated right down the middle. That picture I showed you just a moment ago, right here, that lower picture is in one of those buildings. And you see the line goes right through the building and is manned on both sides by Southern forces and Northern forces. Well, in 1976, it was noticed that the bridge of no return, which is down in the off to the lower left, well, it was under observation at all times because it led directly to North Korea. Well, there was a tree right about there. Well, trees grow, and so did this one. And as observed from the press building, the tree obstructed the view of this critical bridge. This next picture shows you what it looks like from the press looking towards the tree and the bridge. Kind of a problem. Anybody who's been in the military knows you like to have a good field of fire. You need to be able to see where you're going and what's happening. Well, that tree was an issue. So in August of 1976, American forces gathered a small group of 18 soldiers led by a captain and a first lieutenant, and they went down with pruning equipment to prune the tree. They began pruning. A North Korean force crossed over the bridge and demanded that they stop. The American captain turned his back on him, refusing. They watched for 15 minutes before the North Korean called out commands, and a truck came across the bridge filled with Korean soldiers. They jumped out. The Korean officer carefully took off his wristwatch and wrapped it in a napkin and put it in his pocket, and then yelled, "Kill the bastards." The attack lasted only a few minutes. The two officers, Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett, were beaten to death. The others were scattered. It was over almost as quickly as it began. American forces would not take this standing down or sitting down, and they gathered a major task force of over 800 soldiers, supported by attack helicopters, fighter jets, and B-52s, as well as a full division of artillery. And they went in, and on the 21st, they finished the job on the tree. The tree was left standing exactly that way until 1989, when it was replaced by a monument. The North Koreans, after a few days, apologized, said nothing personal, and the event was allowed to pass. It stands today as the worst aggression on the DMZ and has not repeated since. But there are shots fired. There are invasions of small groups. The boundary between north and south of 160 miles, the distance from Muskegon to Chicago, is one of the most heavily defended borders in the world. Double wire fence, watchtowers, minefields. The United States has approximately 23,000 soldiers based in South Korea defending that line. The North Koreans are estimated to have somewhere between 1 million to 1.2 million. It is the largest accumulation of artillery in the world. The North Koreans have 12,000 pieces. Imagine 12,000 artillery pieces lined up between Muskegon and Chicago. These, by the way, this picture, if anybody sharpshoots me, those are American M109, 155 howitzers, but the picture is still effective. Every 160 meters is yet another artillery piece, all the way from Muskegon to Chicago. It is phenomenal. And the range of these howitzer pieces will reach Seoul. It's fully expected that if to use the military vernacular, the balloon goes up, Korea and particularly Seoul will be under immediate devastation. One piece every 70 feet. Several mines or several tunnels have been discovered underneath the DMZ. At least 4 of this quality, fully dug out to run the distance between north and south, allowing large numbers to go not crawling, but in fact, walking upright through them. As soon as they are found, they are destroyed, but there is no doubt that they are constantly being dug for possible invasion routes. This is the way of life every day in Korea today. And the North Koreans have upped the ante. We've all been aware of the past few years of North Korean missiles. These are not just bottle rockets. These missiles will reach, some of them, halfway across the United States. The range is devastating, and they are all nuclear capable. It is a concern that has met the attention of our administration currently, even leading up to a summit in June of 2018. It is unknown where that will go from here, but it remains a standing issue. There have been events that have mediated the situation. There was a largely symbolic, telling event during the Seoul Olympics of 2018, where both North and South fielded a joint team. Where North and South fielded a joint team of Northern and Southern Korean under a neutral flag. It is a hopeful sign, but more than anything else, it is a sign that as sure as the sun rises tomorrow, the North and South Koreans wish to be reunited as a single country, reunited with their countrymen, reunited with their families. North Korea, South Korea, the Korean conflict The Korean conflict has often been called the Forgotten War. Much as Peggy hinted at in the opening, there is little understood about what happened over those years in Korea. Who fought, why we fought, what we fought for, what we ultimately achieved. Most people are surprised to hear that it is simply a ceasefire, not an end, even to this day. The Forgotten War. But it's certainly not forgotten to all. It's not forgotten to the young men who sat next to their big brothers returning from the Great World War II, listening to their exploits and hoping that someday they too might share in the glory, and Korea might provide them that. Some 1.8 million American men and women served in Korea during those years. They're older. They're disappearing daily, soon to be gone, and we will see them no more, except perhaps in the faces on the statues. But their faces are not gone. Their story is not done. Their contribution is far from over. For the faces of the Korean War veterans can still be seen today on the faces of our American soldiers serving around the world. The missions that they perform are those that were first tread by the Korean War veterans from 1950 to 1953. What they began in Korea has been continued in the Middle East, in Europe, elsewhere around the world. And as long as there is the need to defend the helpless and to assist free peoples in their struggles, Korea will not be a forgotten war. I ask you to indulge me a little bit on this final thought. I've often spoken in these lectures and said that history is largely not a matter of fact, but a matter of opinion. None of us were there when Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. None of us were there when George Washington paddled across to attack the Hessians at Trenton. History is a matter of words being handed down from generation to generation. A human being, someone, almost like Homer telling the Odyssey, passing down the exploits of what has gone before. History is a matter of a human being unavoidably flavoring what he or she has seen or known and passing it on. We cannot help but flavor what we say with our beliefs and how we think. And history is affected accordingly. It's why it's so important to read as many different angles of history as possible, because every angle is slightly different of the same event and will give you a better idea. I was born in 1954, 1 year after Korea. My father was a career Army officer. He had fought in World War II. He had been a military governor in Korea after the war. But the world that I grew up in the mid to late 50s, was one that movies still show. It was an idyllic place of suburbs, a flower garden, cars with big fins. My dad had a 1956 Chrysler New Yorker. It had fins as big as my room. I still remember it. It was an America that was still basking in the glory of having defeated the Japanese and defeated the Nazis. And we were, quite frankly, on top of the world. I felt that as a child. But I also soon, as I grew a little bit older, came to feel something else that was passed on to us, something else that Korea helped happen in our world. We became aware that there were people that wanted to do us harm. There were terrible nightmares out there that could end this idyllic existence. Even the most innocent among us were taught how to supposedly protect ourselves. I remember this. That could have been me there. I remember doing this in kindergarten, learning that when you hear the air raid siren, you get under your desk and you make a small ball and put your hands over your head, and that will protect you against the bomb. It was a fearful thing. And that there were others who were suffering, who didn't have the world we had. All of this was like sediment in the soul of the psyche of America. We realized that the world was not all sunshine and roses. Oh, sure, in the daylight, go away and we'd feel good again. But in the night, nightmares would return. And that has never left us. We would soon move on to Vietnam, Watergate, 9/11. It was not a bad thing. It was a realistic thing. We could not go on with our head in the clouds and our feet floating off the ground. We needed to have a grounding, an appreciation of what is real, what is expected of us, what others do and say. And Korea did that for us. It took our heads out of the clouds. It put our feet on the ground. It made us realize that all was not easy. Life was to be fought, if not with weapons, certainly with our best efforts. This concludes then Korea, and it concludes the fall lecture series of The World Transformed 1945 to 1953. What questions do you have?
Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have.
Oh, that was deep. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You know, Cliff,
Yeah.
I struggled as to whether or not I had, whether it was appropriate, and decided to go ahead and throw it out there. I hope that
Oh,
that's
that was
okay.
good. That was very appropriate.
Yes.
Ron, this is Kurt Troutman.
Sure.
Ron, always good to hear from you. Thank you for just a really quality, in-depth presentation. Question I'd like to pose to you. This was a United States and Russia event. Did we drag Korea into this, a place they did not want to be? They were a self-governing peninsula for thousands of years. Is this the United States and Russia's fault, not Korea's?
Well, it is true that at the conclusion of the war, Russia, because it had come into the war only days before the Japanese capitulated, demanded that they have spoils of war, and they demanded that Korea be split. Do we blame it on the Russians? Do we blame it on the US? The United Nations, the Peace Commission chose to give the Russians what they asked for, probably coming out of Tehran and coming out of Potsdam, it was probably an agreement that the Russians would get some war spoils, and among them, they chose Korea. It happened. Once the die was thrown and Russia moved in, Russia, I believe, instigated, certainly encouraged the North Koreans to do the invasion, which led to the outbreak of the war. I don't think it was purely US-Russia. It may have begun that way, but it became a Korean thing when the North Koreans were given the go-ahead to invade South Korea. I don't know if that's a real answer to your question, but I don't think we can simplify it to just North versus, America versus the Soviet Union.
Well, there were
imposing.
several other splits. What was it? The Kuril Islands in northern Japan was
Yes.
split north and south. We could even go to Europe, the splitting of Berlin, part of Austria. And at the time, the splitting of Korea would have been just another split. That one spilled over, though, as you have pointed out.
Vietnam too. Vietnam's an interesting story in that
True.
Ho Chi Minh was in Paris in 1919 as an ardent nationalist seeking to unify his country, Vietnam, away from French domination. And he went to Paris to meet his idol, Woodrow Wilson, and petitioned to have a private meeting, and Woodrow Wilson turned him down. And the rest is history. He went on, fought a civil war in Vietnam. He fought against the Japanese on the Allied side, but when that concluded, he went back to his first love of demanding freedom and independence along the Wilsonian ideal. Now, he got backing from the Soviets. Is that purely a US versus USSR? I think it worked into the paradigm, but it didn't start out that way. It was simply a guy wanting to free his country. We can talk about Cuba the same way. Castro wanting to free his country from the corruption of the previous government and the domination of American fruit companies. I think the paradigm of the Truman Doctrine easily allowed the United States to step in, whether invited or not invited. But the conflicts were there before that.
Excellent answer. And then Ron, I got a quick follow-up question that's much easier.
Okay.
You indicated that your father was part of the post-war government. Were you born in Korea at a military base?
No, I was not. Dad was a military governor in Daegu, South Korea, in 1948, 1949. And I wasn't born until 1954. Following Korea, Dad headed off to Eastern Europe. And because I was telling Peggy that because he was fluent in Polish and Russian, he actually worked for the CIA behind the lines for a number of years in the early 50s. Mom and my two older brothers were living in Munich. And just before they returned to the United States, they went to Vesuvius, and supposedly it was somewhere in Italy that I was conceived, and that's why I have the darkest skin of all of my siblings. And then I was born in New Jersey.
Thank you, sir.
That may fall into the category of TMI. Thank you.
We like to get up close and personal with all of our speakers. It's just,
There you go.
it makes it so much more friendly. When we edit, we'll make sure we edit that out for you so that the
All
whole,
right.
Well, your family got out of Daegu just in time then, didn't they?
They did.
Yeah.
In fact, twice over. My dad left just before the war broke out.
Uh-huh.
And here about a little over a year ago, my son went to Korea to teach English. And he was in Daegu. And only, I guess it was last February, he chose to come back to the United States, left, and about a week after he left, Daegu became the epicenter of the COVID explosion in Korea.
Really?
So Janowski's have been twice over, just out of, just ahead of the train.
Sure.
May I ask a question?
Shoot.
You talked about Russia coming into the war. It stopped or was over with. Do you think that they joined just because they had an eye on Korea and wanted to be part of it so they could demand something?
Oh, hell
as
yes.
part of Korea?
Yes. Yes. The
You-
Russians saw an opportunity to expand by joining the war. Last week, I had a slide up that said that Hiroshima was bombed on the 6th of August, 1945, Nagasaki on the 9th of August, 1945. Russia formally declared war on Japan on the 8th of August, 1945. Yeah, of course they joined just in time in order to be able to claim war spoils. And they grabbed Sakhalin Island, and they got a division of Korea. I was telling Peggy, my dad died just before the wall fell in 1989, and he and I were together about a week before he sank into a coma. And we watched the wall falling, and one of the last words he ever said to me was, "Don't trust the Russians."
Patton actually pushed at the end of World War II that we not stop. And he really wanted to go and continue on into Russia at that point because he had a lot of fears about Russia. And
Absolutely.
he really wanted to pursue the conflict a little bit further at the end of the war.
Yeah, thank God we didn't look at the experience of Napoleon and Hitler and anybody else who's tried to invade Russia.
Patton
Yeah.
would have been short about 100 divisions, so
Yeah,
just as well he didn't.
yeah.
Well, I don't doubt that Patton would have taken the same line that MacArthur did. And he would have said, hell, we got nukes. We talked last week about LeMay and MacArthur. I think Patton would have been of that same ilk. I think he would have said, you go until you win. And we've already demonstrated the ability to use nuclear weapons. And in the 1950s, the use of nuclear weapons would become a primary force multiplier for the US Army against the massive Russian army. We couldn't possibly field an army as big, and it became US Army policy to supplement our smaller numbers with nuclear weapons on the battlefield.
In a defensive manner.
Largely defensive, yes. Well, yeah, clearly defensive. We would not have initiated.
Right.
But we certainly would have seen it as a necessary means. And we saw that through the 60s with outrageous weapons like the Davy Crockett, a nuclear bazooka whose explosive radius was greater than its maximum range. So you literally had to be behind a mountain and duck when you fired it. In the 1970s, I was in command of field artillery along the Fulda Gap facing Russian divisions, and I was armed with nuclear-tipped shells. They were small, ludicrously small, and they've been withdrawn now, but it was thought it's all we're going to have to stop the massive flood coming at us.
Well,
It's always been
that goes back a few years, but I remember at one time, I believe we had we were facing 5,000 Russian tanks coming through the Fulda Gap. Fortunately, we had 25,000 anti-tank weapons, so they kind of held them back, as I recall it.
Yeah, I would have been the one howitzer left behind to try to slow them down as the rest of my battery retreated to the rear.
True.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out this evening. And I hope that you have a very healthy, happy holiday season. We'll be in contact with you in the beginning of the new year to fill you on all the details of our spring series. And we're very excited to be offering them. We will continue doing the Zoom series for the spring. And hopefully by fall, things will be better, that we will start being back in person, but we'll always keep that Zoom component for those that are unable to join us. And I appreciate each and every one of you and all of you that you support, that you all give the museum. And thank you from the USS Silversides. And enjoy the rest of your fall.
And we
Thank
thank
you,
Ron,
Peggy.
we thank Ron for an
Oh,
excellent
yes.
presentation.
Wonderful, wonderful job, Ron.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, hope to see you all soon.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.